The town remembered the wedding for one reason. She stood a full head taller than the groom. He used a cane to reach the altar. And when the preacher asked if she took this man, the whole church held its breath, waiting, maybe hoping for her to come to her senses. She didn't. Wren Aldridge married Emmett on a Thursday in the spring of 1874. She married a man who couldn't lift a feed sack without resting. A man who walked with a limp and spoke so quietly you had to lean in to catch it. A man the whole county of Granger, Nebraska had already written off before he'd driven his first stake into the ground. They were wrong about him. But it would take a full summer of drought, a rich man's lawyers a night of deliberate destruction, and one small spring that refused to run dry before anyone in that valley understood just how wrong they had been. This is not a story about a man who proved the doubters wrong. This is a story about the woman who saw what no one else could see, who fought the battle no one knew she was fighting, and who won it in a way that left the most powerful man in the county standing in a room full of neighbors with dried mud on his Goodtown boots and nothing left to say. Wren Calloway was 31 years old when she made the decision everyone in her life had an opinion about. She had a straight back and strong hands and a face that didn't apologize for itself. She could drive a team mend a roof, split a cord of wood before noon. She had options. Everyone said so. Everyone meaning the women who pursed their lips at Sunday services, and the men who watched her walk past the mercantile with something careful in their eyes. And she had chosen Emmett Aldridge, Emmett who stood 5'7" in his good boots, who weighed less than most of the women in the church, who walked with a limp from a wagon accident 15 years back that had left his left leg shorter than his right and had never fully let him forget it, who made his living repairing clocks and surveying instruments in a small shop in Columbus, Ohio, who had soft hands and a quiet voice and a habit of going completely still when he was thinking that made people nervous because they couldn't tell if he was slow or somewhere else entirely. He was somewhere else entirely. Wren knew that. It was the thing she had seen in him that nobody else had bothered to look for. But standing at the altar on that Thursday in April 1874, with Emmett's hand light in hers and the whole congregation breathing behind her like a held question, Wren felt the first thread of doubt pull loose in her chest. Not about him, about everything that came after him. The land. The quarter section at the western edge of Granger, where the prairie tilted gently toward a draw lined with cottonwoods. The previous claimant had lasted 2 seasons and walked away with nothing but a sunburn and a lesson. The one before him had lasted 14 months. The soil was good. Everyone agreed on that. Rich and dark and willing. But the water was stingy. There was a spring, one spring, a seep really rising from the base of a low ridge behind the house and producing a thread of water so thin you could cover it with your palm. It ran perhaps 50 feet across the grass before the earth swallowed it whole. In the heat of summer, it didn't even make it that far. It just rose and disappeared, like it was embarrassed to be so small, two families had tried to make something of it and failed. Now it belonged to Emmett and Wren. And Wren, standing in her wedding dress while the preacher said his words, was doing the arithmetic and trying to keep her face still. They arrived at the claim on a Sunday evening in late April. The wagon carried 2 trunks, a crate of tools, a box of books, 4 old barrels Emmett had insisted on bringing from Columbus that Wren had thought were a strange thing to haul across 4 states, but had not argued about, and a canvas tarp from a wagon cover so old and patched it looked like a quilt made by someone in a hurry. The house was still standing. That was the first good thing. It was not much of a house. 1 room, a loft, a stone fireplace that smoked if you didn't feed it correctly, windows that let in wind through the frames. But the walls were solid, and the roof held, and Wren had grown up in worse. Emmett set his cane against the doorframe and stood in the doorway, looking out at the land for a long time without speaking. Wren waited. That was the thing about being married to a quiet man. You learned to wait, not the impatient waiting of someone marking time. The other kind. The kind where you understood that something was happening even if you couldn't see it. "Good fall to the draw," Emmett said finally. Wren looked at the land. She saw dry grass in distance and a line of cottonwoods at the bottom where the ground dipped. She saw the problem, which was that everything needed water, and the water was not there. "Is that good?" she said. "It will be." He went inside. She stood a moment longer looking at the dry quarter section in the last of the evening light. She thought about the women at her wedding. The pursed lips, the careful eyes. Then she followed her husband inside and started a fire. That first night after supper, Emmett did not read, did not sleep. He sat at the table with a sheet of paper and his good compass and his surveying level, and he began to draw. Not the house, not the outbuildings. He drew the land itself. The ridge behind the house, the long, slow fall toward the draw, the shallow depression where water would pool after rain, the 50-foot run of the spring before it vanished. He marked figures, inches of drop per 100 feet, the angle of the slope, the position of the sun in July. Wren watched him from across the table with her mending in her lap and said nothing for a long time. Then, "What are you doing?" "Listening," he said. She looked at the paper. It looked like veins, like the inside of a leaf held up to the light. Everything branching from one small source. She didn't understand it yet, but she recognized the focus on his face. She had seen it in his shop in Columbus, the way he bent over a broken movement with a loop in his eye, seeing something no one else could see in the arrangement of tiny parts. Finding the one gear that had slipped, the one spring under too much tension. He was doing that now, to the land. She went to bed. He stayed at the table. When she woke in the gray before dawn, he was still there, the lamp low, the paper covered in his small, careful writing. Roland Hatch came on the second morning. He arrived in a plain wagon rather than the brass-fitted buggy he would use in later months.
Making a neighborly impression, first Ren would understand eventually before he let you see the rest of him.
He was a broad man, 52 years old, with a face that had been weathered into something that looked like friendliness if you didn't look at the eyes. He owned the mercantile in Granger. He owned, as Wren would come to learn, a great deal more than the mercantile. He had wanted the Aldridge Quarter section for himself, had assumed it would come to him the way unclaimed things in Granger had a way of eventually coming to Roland Hatch. He had been waiting for it. He greeted them with warmth, complimented the house, the view, Emmett's surveying instruments stacked neatly on the shelf. He talked about the county, the neighbors, the particular cruelties of Nebraska weather. He had the manner of a man sharing hard-earned wisdom. Then he got to the point.
"You'll want to sink a well," he said to Emmett, not looking at Wren. "Deep as you can manage. The water table out here drops in a dry summer, drops further than you'd think. Every man who's lasted on this land has gone deep." He let his eyes travel over Emmett's slight frame, the cane resting against the table, the thin wrists, the way Emmett stood with his weight on his right side. "Takes a strong back," Hatch said pleasantly. "Course you might find it useful to hire some help. I've got men who know this ground. I could extend credit on fair terms. Get you started right." He smiled. Emmett looked at him for a moment with that still expression that made people uncomfortable. "That's generous," Emmett said. "I'll think on it." Hatch nodded, left his offer in the room like furniture, shook Emmett's hand, tipped his hat to Wren, and drove back toward town. Wren waited until the sound of the wagon had faded. "He wanted the land," she said. "Yes. He thinks we'll fail. He's counting on it." Emmett went back to his paper. Wren stood at the window watching the dust from Hatch's wagon settle and felt something sharpen in her chest. Not quite anger. Something cooler than anger. The kind of feeling you get when someone underestimates you so completely that they've handed you an advantage without knowing it. She filed it away. Kept it. They didn't sink a well. Wren had been ready for the argument. She had grown up on a farm in Ohio where everything was done the same way it had always been done, because that was how you survived, and deviation from proven methods was how you didn't. She had braced herself to push back on Emmett's paper and his drawings and his surveying level and his certainty. But that evening, he spread the drawing across the table and walked her through it, slowly, in the patient way he had of explaining things, never talking down, never assuming she would not follow. The spring gave 2 barrels a day, give or take depending on heat and season. Not enough to dig from, not enough to throw at the surface in the hope that something took. But 2 barrels a day, every single day, delivered precisely to the roots of the things that needed it, without wasting a drop to evaporation or runoff. That was enough. His finger traced the lines on the paper. The land fell 11 inches every 100 feet from the spring toward the draw. Water wanted to go downhill, so they wouldn't fight it. They would use it. They would build channels that walked the water downhill slowly at a speed and angle they controlled and deliver it directly to root level where the heat of the day couldn't reach it. He told her what he wanted to build. Split log flumes hollowed with an adze, clay from the creek bank for the joints. The 4 old barrels set at descending heights along the slope to collect and settle and distribute the flow. The wagon canvas stretched between stakes to carry water across the one low spot that the slope wanted to skip over. "We can't afford pipe," Wren said. "We can't afford anything." "We don't need pipe. We need cottonwood, which is in the draw. We need clay, which is in the bank. We need the barrels we already have, and we need the canvas, which we already have. And we need someone who can split logs and haul clay and drive stakes." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "We need that too." She looked at the drawing for a long time. It still looked like the veins of a leaf, everything reaching from one small center, branching and dividing until even the furthest corner of the garden would drink. "They'll laugh," she said. "They're already planning to." "That doesn't bother you."
"Laughing doesn't grow corn,"
he said.
"Wren."
He waited until she looked up from the paper. "I can't dig. I've made my peace with that. But I can do this. Every cut, every fitting, every joint. I can do all of it. I just can't do it fast, and I can't do it standing." She thought about the women at the wedding, the pursed lips. Clever doesn't break sod. "All right," she said. "We don't dig, we listen." They began the next morning before the light was full in the sky. Wren went to the draw first, while Emmett set his stakes and string along the master line, checking each one against the level, adjusting by fractions until the fall was exactly what he wanted. 1 inch of drop for every 12 feet of run, gentle enough that the water would walk, not run. Walk. She found the cottonwoods he had marked the evening before, straight-grained, dry enough to work the right diameter. She felled the first one herself with the hand axe, limbed it, cut it to length, and then discovered that rolling a log up a slope without a team or a block and tackle is exactly as difficult as it sounds. It took her 2 hours and most of her dignity, but she got it there. Emmett had built himself a working frame from scrap lumber. 2 sawhorses with a board across set to a height where he could sit or lean and bring the work to him instead of bending to the ground. He picked up the adze and looked at the log, and then he began. The work was slow. That was the truth of it. No one was going to write a story about how quickly Emmett Aldridge hollowed a cottonwood log. He worked in the deliberate, unhurried way of a man who has learned that rushing costs more than it saves. He cut across the grain in even strokes, clearing the heartwood in sections. He rested when his leg ached. Started again. The adze found a rhythm eventually, a sound like a slow clock. Wren worked beside him, hauling logs, splitting kindling for the fireplace so they'd have evenings free for other work. digging out the clay from the creek bank in heavy wet armloads and carrying it up in a bucket. By noon, they had the first flume laid. It ran from the mouth of the spring to the top barrel, a distance of perhaps 30 feet, fitted on low trestles. Emmett had notched into stakes driven at the surveyed height. The joints were packed with creek clay smoothed until there were no gaps. At the end of each flume where it met the next, Emmett had carved a small lip that caught the water and directed it without splashing. Wren set the first barrel upright at the end of the line. Emmett opened the spring's mouth with a small clay dam and a notched diversion. And the water came, thin, slower than a walking man, but real. Clean water moving along the hollowed log in a line so deliberate it looked almost thoughtful, and dripping into the waiting barrel with a sound so small you had to be quiet to hear it. Wren stood back with sweat on her collar and dust on her hands and watched it run. The first thing she felt was something so close to foolish hope that she almost pushed it back down. She didn't. Cora Finch appeared on the third day. She came from the claim to the east, walking across the shared fence line without announcement or explanation, which Wren would later understand was simply how Cora Finch moved through the world. She was 48 years old, a widow, and she had been farming that east claim alone since 1854, when she and her husband Milo had come up from Kansas and staked it. Milo had died in 1861. Cora had stayed. She had a face that told the whole story of 20 years of Nebraska weather. She walked with a stick not from injury, but from preference. She was not a woman who wasted words or sentiment. She came and stood at the edge of the work and watched. She watched for a full hour without saying anything. Emmett kept working. Wren kept working. Cora observed. Then Milo tried this out in the dry country near Dodge before we came north. People called him a fool. She looked at the flume, the barrel, the thin line of water making its way down the carved channel. He called it courting water, she said. Not pushing, not pulling, courting. You bring something to court a person. You make yourself worth coming toward. She studied Emmett for a moment. You've got the fall right, she said. Most men make it too steep and the water runs past the roots. You've got it slow enough to soak. Then she walked back to her own claim. Wren looked at Emmett. He was smiling, not broadly, just at the corners. June came dry and stayed that way. It had been thin all spring, the rain arriving in small, grudging amounts that wetted the surface and left the ground beneath it unchanged. Now it stopped entirely. The sky over Granger, Nebraska, went a flat, pale color that was not quite blue, not quite white, not quite anything. Just absence. Across the county, the corn began to curl. It started at the edges of the leaves, a rolling inward like a hand closing into a fist. A defense. The plant shutting itself down to save what little moisture remained in the stem. Wren had seen it before in Ohio, but never like this. never countywide. The men who had sunk deep wells found the water table had dropped below them. Not all the way, but enough. The trenches dug for runoff channels held cracked gray mud and nothing else. Roland Hatch appeared at the mercantile more often, more visible, more present at the counter where men gathered to talk, and where talking in a dry summer has a way of turning into borrowing. Wren went for flour on the last Friday of June and heard 3 families mentioned by name. Behind on their notes, Hatch extending terms, generous terms, the kind that tighten slowly. She came home with the flour and the news and stopped at the sight of Emmett behind the house, kneeling at the spring with his small level and a length of string, making an adjustment to the master line, perfectly unhurried, as though the drought outside their fence was happening in a different county entirely. The barrels were holding. Wren walked to the garden and stood in the middle of it and tried to see it the way a stranger driving past on the section road would see it. Green. Actually green. The cabbage heads were thickening. The beans had climbed halfway up their poles. The carrot tops feathered thick and dark exactly as they should be. The 6 young fruit trees she had nursed from slips through 3 states and planted in the low bench of ground near the draw had deepened from the pale, anxious color they'd had in May to something glossy and sure. The rest of the valley was beginning to brown. She stood in the green middle of it and felt the weight of what that meant. They were visible now, and visibility in a county where men were failing and one man was waiting for them to fail was not a simple thing. On a still evening in early July, Emmett explained the philosophy of the thing, not the mechanics. She understood those. She had built half of it with her own hands. The philosophy. They were sitting on the back step watching the last gate run. The heat had finally gone out of the air. The water moved through the lowest line in its slow, faithful way.
The sun can't take what it can't reach,
he said.
Everything we're losing in this county right now is surface loss. Rain hits the ground, sits there. The sun takes it back before the roots can find it. Dig a well and pull it up and pour it on same problem. The surface steals it back.
He reached out and slid a gate open. Water turned left into the bean row. But put it down at root depth below where the sun reaches and it stays. The roots find it and it stays. We're not fighting the drought. We're going underneath it. Wren thought about that. Hatch's men are still digging, she said. Yes, and the wells are still dropping. Yes. How long before someone comes over the fence to ask? He was quiet for a moment. When they're scared enough, he said. Fear is a powerful teacher, but people want to be scared the right amount. Scared enough to try something new. Not so scared that their pride won't let them admit they were wrong. She looked at the green rose in the evening light. She thought about Roland Hatch. She had found the list 3 nights ago. She had not meant to find it. She had been looking in Emmett's coat pocket
for the small folding rule he sometimes left there, and her fingers had found paper instead. She unfolded it without thinking. A list in Emmett's careful handwriting, names and parcels. The north claim, the river claim, the 200 acres east of the road. Notes beside each name. Terms, dates, and beside each name in every single line, Hatch R. 17 families in Granger County, every one of them carrying a note with Roland Hatch's name on it. She had refolded the paper and put it back. She wasn't sure why she hadn't said anything yet. Partly because she needed time to understand what she was looking at. Partly because she understood it immediately and needed time to decide what to do with that understanding. Hatch didn't need them to fail. He needed them to need him. It was a different thing, subtler. A man who needs you to fail will push you. A man who needs you to need him will wait. He'll let the drought do the work. He'll be generous with credit at the exact moment when the terms don't matter to a desperate man. He'll extend and extend until the extension is the trap. 17 families. And Emmett, with his split log flumes and his barrel system and his little book of daily figures, was building something that a desperate county might learn to copy. If it worked. If enough people saw that it worked. If Granger County learned to need less water, it learned to need less from Hatch. This wasn't a dispute about a spring. It was a dispute about dependency. She kept her face still, kept her voice even. She put the list in her own pocket and filed it with the other thing she'd been carrying since April. The coolness in her chest that wasn't quite anger. She was going to need it. Denton Briggs stopped his mule at the fence on the 14th of July. Wren saw him from the garden, standing in the road, staring over the top rail at the cabbage rows. His own corn was brown and rattling. His face had the particular expression of a man who has been certain about something his whole life and has just been handed evidence that he might want to reconsider. He didn't like the evidence. Emmett called over pleasantly that it was the spring, the little seep behind the house, that it watered all of it every day and they just didn't waste any. Briggs looked at the flumes, the barrels, the sagging canvas lines that carried water across the low spot near the fruit trees. He looked at the system the way a man looks at something he doesn't have a category for. Then his face arranged itself into the comfort of dismissal. "Looks like a child's whirligig," he said. "Sticks and string. First real heat wave, that thing'll dry out and rot." He clucked to his mule. Wren watched him go and felt the familiar sting. The same one from the wedding. The same one from Hatch's first visit. But she also noticed the thing that happened just before Briggs turned away. He looked at the carrot tops one more time. Just for a moment. The way you look at something you told yourself not to want. She noted it. The carrots were doing their work. Roland Hatch came on a Thursday in the 3rd week of July. The brass-fitted buggy this time. The hired man driving. He did not get down from the seat staying elevated, staying in the position of someone passing through, rather than someone who could be questioned. He looked at the garden for a long time,
without speaking. Emmett was working at the far end of the slope. He looked up, said nothing. "Quite a kitchen garden," Hatch said. His voice was pleasant. His eyes were not. "Thank you," Wren said.
"Pity it won't scale."
He smiled at Emmett across the fence.
"A garden's one thing. A man can't feed a county off sticks and barrels."
Emmett straightened slowly, weight on his right side.
"No," he said, "but he can feed his family, for now."
Hatch tilted his head toward the flat brown nothing of the valley. "Springs quit in a drought like this one. I've seen it. Good springs, deep springs, they quit." He shifted his eyes to Wren with the expression of a man offering something valuable for free. "When that happens, my door's open. Same offer I made in April. Good terms for good families." He nodded to his man. The buggy rolled away. Wren stood at the fence and watched it go and did not move until the dust had settled back into the road. Good terms. She thought about the 17 names, the terms that had seemed reasonable in a desperate spring, and then quietly tightened through summer until they fit around a man's throat like a collar. She had work to do. Cora Finch came over the fence the following Tuesday afternoon. She sat herself on an upended bucket near the lowest barrel and watched Wren work for a while without speaking. Then Hatch told Leland Pruitt at the feed store that standing water in old barrels is how you get sickness, that he'd heard of families losing children to barrel water. Wren went still. There it was. Not an argument about the system. Not a debate about water rights. Just the oldest weapon. The one that didn't need to be true. It just needed to be said in the right tone by the right man in the right place. Wren straightened slowly and looked at Cora. "He's afraid," Cora said. "He's dangerous," Wren said. "Those are the same thing sometimes." Cora set down her trowel. Hatch lost his father's farm in 1858. Bank called the note in a dry year. He rode away from that farm looking like someone had taken something out of him that didn't grow back. He built everything since then on being the man who holds the notes, never the one who owes. Wren stood in the garden and let that settle. Hatch wasn't simply greedy. He was a man who had been ruined once and had decided the only safety in the world was to become the thing that ruined others. Everything he'd built, the mercantile, the notes, the credit, the quiet waiting, was a fortress. Not against poverty, against the feeling of poverty. That didn't make him less dangerous, but it made him comprehensible. And a comprehensible enemy is easier to prepare for than a mysterious one. "He's going to go to law," Wren said. Cora looked at her steadily. "Yes," she said. "He is." "We'll need witnesses." "Honest ones," Cora said. "Not grateful ones. People who'll stand up in front of Aldous Marsh and say what they know, even knowing what they owe." "Will you?" "I've been farming beside that spring for 20 years," Cora said. I know what it does in a dry summer. She picked up her trowel. Yes, I'll say what I know. Wren started back toward the house. Wren! Cora said it without looking up from the soil. Afraid men don't know when to stop. Wren already knew that. The legal notice arrived on the first morning of August. The same hired man who drove the brass-fitted buggy brought it to the door. He handed it to Wren without meeting her eyes and left immediately, which told her everything about how he felt about the errand. She read it standing in the doorway. The argument was thin. She had expected thin. The spring's water drained toward a draw that crossed a corner of Hatch's land to the southwest. The creek in that draw fed north through Hatch's spread. By capturing the water before it reached the draw, Emmett had unlawfully diverted water belonging by prior use to Hatch's downstream property. Prior use. 2 words that could mean everything in a county built on water rights, or nothing, depending on who was doing the deciding. She took the notice to Emmett in the workshop shed where he was fitting a replacement joint on the third barrel's outlet. He read it, set it down, was quiet. She watched his face. There it was. The tightening around his eyes she had never seen before. Not fear of Hatch, fear of her, of what she might think, of whether at the end of this summer, after all of it, the cane and the doubt from the whole town, and the drought, and the slow, careful work. And now this, she would look at him and finally see what they all saw. He set the notice down very carefully. He wants the spring, Wren said. He wants us gone from this land and back under his roof, asking for credit, Emmett said. There's a difference. He said it without self-pity. Wren looked at her husband for a moment, the thin hands, the cane leaning against the table, the lamp casting its light across the same paper he had been working at since their first night on this land. She reached across the table and picked up his pencil. Then we prepare, she said. What do we need? He looked at her. That look. She would remember it for the rest of her life. Numbers, he said. I have every day since June. How much the spring gives, how far the water travels before it sinks. I can prove the water never reached his creek. I can prove there's no prior use to claim, because the water never got far enough to be used by anyone. And witnesses. And witnesses. He nodded. People who farmed near that draw long enough to know it. Cora. Cora. And whoever else isn't too afraid of his paper to stand up and say the plain truth. Wren folded her hands on the table. I'll go see Cora in the morning, she said. Then I'm going to go see some of the others. She paused. Alone. Emmett looked at her. Some of these families will talk to me in ways they won't talk with you standing next to me. And there are things I need to say that are better said without you hearing me say them. He considered her. All right, he said. She picked up his pencil and pulled the paper toward her. Show me the figures, she said. All of them.
I want to understand every number before anyone tries to argue with them.
He pulled his small book from his pocket and set it on the table between them. Outside, the summer dark settled over the quarter section. The spring went on giving its small measure into the first barrel. The system ran in the dark as it ran in the light. Wren leaned over the figures in the lamplight and began to read. July had been the month of green and watching eyes. The sky over Granger County had become a lid, a pressed-down weight of pale heat that sat on the land from before sunrise and did not lift until well after dark. The grass along the section roads went the color of old paper. Everything in the county that was not being deliberately tended was in the process of giving up. The Aldridge Quarter section was being deliberately tended, and it showed. It showed in a way that could not be explained away or attributed to luck. The cabbage heads had closed into tight fists of dark green. The bean vines had climbed their poles and begun reaching past the tops, looking for more pole finding, only air, and still climbing. The carrot tops stood thick and feathery. The 6 fruit trees on the low bench near the draw had leaves so deep in color that in the afternoon light they looked almost wet, green. Actually, genuinely, undeniably green, while the rest of the valley went brown. People drove past on the section road slowly, very slowly. The kind of slow that wasn't about the road conditions. They slowed their wagons and looked over the fence with expressions that moved through several stages. Confusion first. Then the particular stubborn frown of someone trying to find an alternate explanation. Then something quieter. Something that sat between wonder and wounded pride and would not resolve itself into either. Wren saw them from the garden. She kept working. She had learned over the weeks of July to keep her face still when she felt the eyes from the road. It wasn't difficult. She had grown up with eyes on her. Too tall for a girl. Too direct for a woman. Too certain about things women weren't supposed to be certain about. She had a lifetime of practice keeping her face composed while something entirely different moved underneath it. What moved underneath it now was watchfulness. She was watching Roland hatch, and she was making a plan. She went to see Cora the morning after she and Emmett had gone through the figures. She said she was checking the east fence line, which was true in the technical sense that she walked along it to get to Cora's house, which she felt was close enough. Cora was in her garden. Cora was always in her garden. She had the posture of a woman who had decided somewhere in her 40s that she would spend whatever years remained doing exactly the things she chose to do, and no others. She looked up when Wren came through the gate. "Sit," she said, gesturing at a flat-topped rock near the fence post. Wren sat. For a while, they were both quiet. Cora working, Wren watching. The sound of the morning insects, a distant crow, the dry whisper of grass in the small breeze that came up before 9 and stopped by 10. They talked for a long time. About the figures, about the witnesses they would need, about Marsh, the county water commissioner who was a tired man
and owed Hatch money and would be looking for a reason to rule the easy way. "You'll need more than me and the Bachmans," Cora said. "I know."
"Briggs, he shut the door on me last time." Cora looked at her steadily. "He also drove past your garden twice last week on the same day, going different directions. A man with nothing to reconsider doesn't do that." Wren stood up. "I'll go alone," she said. "Yes," Cora said. "You should." Briggs had a claim 2 miles north, 160 acres of mostly flat land that in a good year produced reliable corn, and in a bad year produced debt and worry. This was a bad year. His fields were visible from the road, brown-edged and rattling and tired. Wren knocked at the door. He opened it and looked at her, then past her for Emmett. "He didn't come," she said. Briggs said nothing. "May I come in?" He stepped back, let her in. They stood in his front room, which had the particular feel of a space where a man lived alone and had stopped noticing how it looked because there was no one to notice for. She pulled the list from her pocket and set it on his table. He looked at it. His jaw tightened. "Where did you get that?" "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." Denton, she used his name plainly. "You're on that list. So are 16 other families. And when the hearing comes and Hatch wins it, because he will win it if no one stands up and says what's actually true about that spring, the next piece of paper that moves in this county will be the one he uses to start calling notes." Briggs looked at the list and not at her. "I've got a mortgage," he said. "I know. Hatch holds it. I know. If I stand up in that hearing and contradict him, he'll make it difficult." She held his gaze when he finally looked up. "Yes, he will. I'm not going to tell you otherwise, but your name is on this list regardless. You are already in his hand. Standing up doesn't put you there. You're already there. The question is whether you're in his hand having told the truth, or in his hand having told a lie to protect him." Briggs looked at the list for a long time. His face did the thing faces do when a person is working through something that has more than one answer, and they know it, and they hate knowing it. She did not fill the silence. She had learned that from Emmett. When the space is doing the work, you don't interrupt it. "Finally, what do you need me to say?" "The truth. Only the truth. You farmed north of that draw for 6 years. You know where the water goes in a dry summer. That's all I need." A long pause. "I'll think on it," he said. She picked up the list. "The hearing is the 2nd week of August," she said. "Think quickly." She walked out into the bright heat and back toward the section road. She didn't know if he would come. She genuinely didn't know. And she had learned over this summer to hold uncertainty without collapsing under it. Emmett had taught her that. Not in words, in the way he worked, in the way he adjusted the level and tried again, and adjusted and tried again, without frustration, without the belief that getting it right the first time was what mattered. What mattered was getting it right. Eventually, she went home and told Emmett she had 3 witnesses.
Cora, the Bachman family from the South, claim who had farmed beside the draw since 1866 and had agreed immediately with the quiet fury that suggested they had been looking for a reason to push back on Hatch for years. And possibly Briggs. Possibly. Emmett nodded, started writing figures. They ate supper, went over the numbers again. Wren mended the canvas section on the 3rd water carrier, where the wax had cracked from the heat. Emmett recorded the day's spring output. 2 barrels, 3 cups. Consistent. They went to sleep. The morning of the hearing was hot before the sun was even fully up. Wren woke at 4:30 to a stillness that was wrong. Not the usual stillness of the early dark. Something else. An absence of sound that should have been there. The water. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, moving through the dark kitchen, out the back door in her night things, into the gray pre-dawn light. And she stopped. The master flume had been destroyed. Not weathered. Not failed from age or heat or the ordinary entropy of wood and clay and canvas working against themselves over a long summer. Destroyed. 3 of the split log flumes had been knocked from their trestles and split lengthwise, the wood broken with force, the cracks so clean it could only have been deliberate. The clay joints were smashed, crushed by something heavy, brought down with intent. The top barrel was tipped on its side, emptied, the staves sprung from the force of the fall. The canvas lines hung slack and cut. Not frayed, cut. Clean cuts made with a blade. The whole patient system. The work of a summer. The dozens of quiet early mornings and long evenings and aching muscles and careful measurements. She stood in the wreckage while the sky went from black to gray to the first pale nothing of dawn, and felt for the first time since April something close to defeat. Because you couldn't look at those cut canvas lines and those smashed clay joints and not understand that someone had looked at everything they had built together and decided the proper response was destruction. That someone had walked through the dark and put their hands on the thing that mattered most and broken it deliberately. Not because they had a legal claim to it, because they were afraid of it. The spring was still running. Of course it was. That small seep rising from the base of the ridge the way it had risen every morning of every season for longer than anyone in Granger County could remember was entirely undamaged. Because you cannot destroy a spring. You can only destroy what a person builds to use it. Emmett came out behind her. She heard the uneven step the cane in the soft ground. He came to stand beside her. She waited for what she had been dreading. The silence that meant defeat. The face that meant the last thing in him that still believed had finally let go. He was looking at the spring, not the wreckage, at the spring. His face in the early light had an expression she had never seen before, not despair,
not the controlled devastation of a man holding himself together. Something stranger and quieter. Recognition, like a man who has been asking a question all summer and has just in the worst possible moment finally heard the answer. "He didn't break the spring," Emmett said. His voice was low, steady. "He broke the flumes," she said. "A summer of work."
Yes.
He looked at the tipped barrel, at the cut canvas, at the cracked wood in the mud.
He came onto our land in the dark and destroyed everything we built to use the water. The night before the hearing, where he claims the water is rightfully his. He turned to look at her. "Wren, why would a man destroy the system using water he claims belongs to him?" She stood very still. "Destroying the flumes doesn't send the water to his creek," Emmett said. "It just spills it in our mud. It doesn't help his case. It doesn't help his cattle. It doesn't help anything." He paused. "The only person helped by breaking those flumes tonight is a man who wanted us walking into that hearing broken and without proof that any of it ever worked." She understood. Not a man with a real claim, a man afraid of losing. "He made a mistake," Emmett said quietly. "Yes."
She was already seeing it, already building it the way he built a flume, finding the fall, finding the slope, finding where the logic led. He proved it. He proved he was here. He proved he was afraid enough to come in the night and put his hands on our property. Emmett straightened against his cane. "And I'm going to write down everything he left behind." He went inside and came back with his small book. And then he did what Wren had watched him do all summer with water levels and spring output and barrel capacities. He measured. He recorded. He wrote down the position of every broken flume, every cut canvas edge, every smashed clay joint, and the boot prints. Wren crouched beside them with him in the thin morning light. Deep prints. The soil near the spring mouth was still damp from the night's cool and had taken the impression cleanly. The heel was high. The sole was smooth. Town boots. Not the worn flat brogans of a working farmer, but the kind of boot a man wears when he is the kind of man who does not do the work himself. Deep heel. Heavy man. Emmett sketched them carefully, measured the length, noted the depth. "These aren't a hired man's boots," Wren said. "No." She looked toward Granger, thought about the brass-fitted buggy, the good coat, the smile that never reached the eyes, the man who would not get down from the seat until now. Emmett finished his notes and closed the book. "Go get Cora," he said. Wren was already moving. Cora came across the fence line in the time it took to tell her what had happened. She looked at the boot prints for a long moment with her trowel still in her hand. Then she looked at Wren. "I'll take the sketch to Marsh before the hearing," she said, directly to him, before Hatch's lawyer can set the terms of the mourning. Something shifted in Wren's chest. "He owes Hatch money," Wren said.
"Yes," Cora said.
"But he owes this county something too. He's lived here 30 years. His children grew up here. His wife is buried here." She tucked Emmett's sketch into her apron. A man can owe money to one person and still owe honesty to everyone else. It just depends on which debt he decides matters more when the room is full. She walked back to her cart. Wren stood in the wreckage of the summer's work and watched the old woman drive toward town. She was not alone in this. She had never been alone in it. But she was only now feeling the full weight of that. The Bachmans who had said yes with that quiet old fury. Briggs who might come and might not, but had listened. Cora who had farmed beside this spring for 20 years and feared no one and had tucked a folded piece of paper into her apron and driven toward a compromised man with the certainty of someone who has decided what kind of person she is and does not intend to revisit it. Emmett came to stand beside her.
"We should get ready,"
he said. She looked at the broken flumes, the cut canvas, the tipped barrel with the mud drying on its staves. She had built those canvas sections herself. Every stitch, every coat of wax. She picked up one end of the cut canvas and looked at the edge. Clean cut, sharp blade, done quickly. She set it back down.
"Leave it,"
Emmett said quietly.
"Leave all of it exactly as it is."
She looked at him. "The ruin," he said, "is the most useful thing we own right now." She understood. She let it go. They went inside. Wren washed her hands, changed into the dress she wore to town, pinned her hair. She moved through these ordinary preparations with a steadiness that surprised her, because underneath the steadiness was something that was not calm and not fear and not quite anger either. It was clarity, the kind that comes when everything uncertain has finally resolved itself into something simple. They had built something real. Someone had tried to destroy it in the dark, and the spring was still running. The road into Granger was already busy at 7:30 in the morning, which was not normal, not for a Tuesday, not for a county in the grip of a drought that had turned most of August into an exercise in endurance. People had things to do, fields to watch, livestock to water from barrels that were themselves getting low. They did not, as a rule, drive toward town on a Tuesday morning unless they needed something specific. But the word had gone out. Wren didn't know exactly how. She suspected Cora. Cora had a way of moving through a county without appearing to move through it. She stopped at this fence, and that gate exchanged a few words, moved on, and somehow those few words had a way of becoming common knowledge by morning. 20 years of careful neighboring had built a network of trust that no amount of money could replicate. The word was simple. Something happened last night at the Aldridge place. Come and see what happens next. So they came. Not all of them. not the families too deep in debt to risk the appearance of opposition, but enough. Enough to fill the Granger Town Hall, which was a single room above the grain broker's office that smelled permanently of corn dust and old wood, with benches in rows and a table at the front where Commissioner Aldous Marsh would sit. Wren and Emmett arrived at 10 minutes before 8. The room was already half full. It had the particular quality of a space containing people who are pretending to be casual, talking to neighbors in low voices, examining the ceiling, doing the elaborate pantomime of not watching the door, while absolutely watching the door. They looked when Emmett and Wren came in. Not all at once, in that staggered way. One person noticing, and the noticing spreading sideways through the room. Emmett walked to a seat near the center. Not the back where you put yourself when you want to be invisible. Not the front where you put yourself when you want to perform confidence. The center. Where you sit when you have nothing to hide and nothing to prove, and you simply intend to be present. Wren sat beside him. She put her hands in her lap and was still. The room filled. Roland Hatch arrived at 5 minutes past 8. He came in through the main door with his lawyer beside him. The lawyer was a man named Colworth from the county seat, compact and efficient, carrying a leather satchel with the expression of someone who had done this many times and found it neither interesting nor distasteful. Just work. Hatch was in his good coat, the dark wool one he wore to church and to county meetings. His boots were polished, or had been polished, because the thing about dried mud is that it doesn't entirely leave a boot even after polish. It leaves a ghost. A fine, pale residue in the seams, in the welt, in the crease where the upper meets the sole. You could see it if you were looking. Wren was looking. She looked once, noted it, looked away. Hatch found his seat at the front. He surveyed the room with the air of a man who had already calculated the outcome and was attending as a formality. His eyes moved across the benches, paused briefly on Emmett, moved on. Didn't land on Wren at all. That, she thought, was his first mistake of the morning. Commissioner Aldous Marsh came in at 8 o'clock exactly. He was a gray man. Not old exactly, but made of gray things, gray hair, gray complexion, gray suit, worn to the particular softness that comes from long use. He had been water commissioner for Granger County for 11 years. He had a reputation for thoroughness and for going home early when he could manage it. He owed Roland Hatch $400. Not a secret, not publicly discussed, but in a county this size these things were known. The loan had been made 3 years ago when Marsh's barn had burned. Hatch had offered the money quietly and without apparent condition in the way generous men do when they want you to feel the generosity and forget the implications. Marsh sat at the table, arranged his papers, did not look immediately at either party. He looked, Wren thought, like a man who had been hoping something would prevent him from having to be here today. Nothing had.
This hearing is called in the matter of a water rights claim,
Marsh said.
His voice was even, professional. Filed by Roland Hatch of this county against Emmett Aldridge of the Aldridge Quarter Section western edge of Granger. He looked at Colworth. Counsel, state the claim. Colworth stood and stated it well. The spring on the Aldridge property fed the draw. The draw crossed Hatch's land to the southwest. The creek in that draw had historically watered Hatch's northern pasture. By capturing the spring water before it reached the draw, Emmett Aldridge had unlawfully diverted a water source belonging by prior use to Roland Hatch. Prior use. Colworth said the words with authority. With the particular confidence of a lawyer who knows that 2 words said correctly in the right room can outweigh any number of facts. He sat down. Marsh looked at Emmett. Mr. Aldridge, you may respond. Emmett did not stand immediately. He let the silence sit for a moment, long enough that the people in the benches leaned forward almost without knowing they were doing it. The way you lean toward a quiet voice in a loud room. Then he stood.
He was slight in that room, smaller than most of the men on the benches. The cane was in his left hand, and he stood with his weight on his right side, which he had done every day of his adult life, and which had long since ceased to look like anything other than simply the way Emmett Aldridge stood. He looked at Marsh.
I'd like to start with a question,
he said.
Not a legal argument, just a question.
His voice was conversational, as though they were at a fence line rather than a hearing.
Mr. Hatch says the spring water flows down the draw to his creek. He says it's his by prior use, so my question is simple. How much of that spring water actually reached his creek last July? Colworth started to speak. Emmett held up his small book. Not aggressively, just held it up. Patient. I measured it, Emmett said. Every day since the first week of June. The spring gives about 2 barrels a day in summer heat. And I measured how far that water travels on its own, before any interference, before it goes into the ground. He opened the book and read. He read plainly. Figures and dates in his clockmaker's handwriting. Spring output each day. Distance traveled before absorption. Rate of evaporation in July temperatures. The progressive drop in surface travel as the summer deepened. In the month of July, he said, the spring water sank into the ground within 50 feet of the source. On the hottest days, less than 40 feet. It did not reach the draw. It has never reached the draw in summer. It cannot reach the draw in summer because the ground between the spring mouth and the draw is porous clay and dry grass, and the sun in July takes back everything the ground does not swallow first. He closed the book. Mr. Hatch's cattle have not drunk from water fed by this spring, Emmett said. His northern pasture has not been watered by this spring. His claim of prior use rests on water that never got far enough to be used by anyone. Before I built my system, that water was lost. Every drop of it, every day, lost to the air. He looked at Marsh. I am not taking terror from Roland Hatch, he said. I am using water that was going to nothing. Marsh was writing. Colworth was on his feet with a counter-argument that the legal principle of prior use applied to the watershed, not merely to the measured travel distance of the water, and that the Aldridge structures interfered with the natural drainage pattern of land Hatch had rights to. It was a reasonable argument, the kind that could widen in favorable conditions. But Emmett had expected it. "Cora Finch," he said simply, and Cora stood. She stood from the second bench without ceremony, chin at the particular angle that meant she had decided something and was done deciding it. She faced Marsh directly. "I've farmed the East Claim beside that draw since 1854, she said. 20 years this August. My late husband and I together, and then alone after he passed." She paused. "I have never in 20 years seen that spring run to the draw in a dry summer. Not once, not a trickle. The water rises and it dies in the grass. It always has." She sat back down, short, absolute. From a woman who had been here longer than most of the families in the room, and who had never, in all that time, been known to say a thing she didn't mean. Marsh wrote. Emmett gestured. The Bachmans stood. Both of them. Husband and wife, which was unusual for a hearing, but neither seemed to notice or care. They had farmed south of the draw since 1866 and confirmed the same thing in the plain, unornamented way of people who simply want to say the true thing and be done. Colworth pushed back, argued that individual observation didn't supersede the legal definition of downstream water rights, argued watershed principles. Marsh was listening. His pen had slowed, and then the door at the back of the room opened. Not dramatically, not swung wide, just opened, and there was Denton Briggs in the doorway in his working clothes, with his hat in his hands, looking at the floor, and then looking up and finding Marsh's face. He came to the front of the room. He stood beside the Bachmans. He looked like a man who had made a decision he was going to have to live with for a long time and had chosen the version of it he could actually live with. "I've been north of that draw 6 years, he said. He didn't look at Hatch. "I know what that spring does in summer. It doesn't run to the draw. You can walk the ground yourself in July and find nothing below the spring mountain but dry grass swallowed. That is what I know." He sat down near the door, like a man who wanted to be ready to leave quickly. But he had come, and he had said it. Colworth shifted. He was good at shifting, at finding the new angle when the first one was blocked. He turned away from prior use and moved toward principle. The legal definition of watercourse rights in the territory of Nebraska did not require proof of actual flow in all seasons. It required demonstration of natural drainage pattern. And the Aldridge structures, regardless of measured summer flow, interrupted that natural pattern. It was a different argument, a more abstract one. And it was the moment Wren had been waiting for since 4:30 that morning. She had not planned to speak. Or rather, she had planned not to speak, and had then realized sometime between leaving the house and arriving in this room that there was a piece of this that Emmett could not deliver. Not because he wasn't capable, because he hadn't been the one holding the sketch of the boot prints when Cora drove away this morning.
because the thing that needed to happen next was something only she could thread correctly. She stood up. Marsh looked at her. Colworth looked at her. The room looked at her. "Commissioner," she said, "before Mr. Colworth continues, there's something you already have that I'd like to address." Marsh looked at his table, at the paper Cora had placed there before the hearing began. He had glanced at it when it was handed to him and set it to the side. He picked it up now. Wren kept her voice even, the way she kept her face even at the fence while eyes came from the road. Steady. Not performing steadiness. Actually steady. "Someone came onto our land last night," she said, "before dawn, and destroyed our irrigation system. The flumes, the barrels, the canvas lines, all of it." She paused. "I want to make sure the commission understands what that means." Colworth started to object. Marsh held up a hand. Slightly, but Colworth stopped.
"If the water is rightfully Mr. Hatch's," Wren said, "then destroying our system doesn't send it to him. The water still goes into the ground 50 feet from the spring. It still never reaches his creek. Destroying our flumes doesn't give him a single additional drop." She let that sit. "The only person helped by destroying our system last night was a person who wanted us to walk into this room this morning without the ability to demonstrate that it worked. Without the measurements. Without the proof." The room was very quiet. "My husband measured those boot prints," she said. "He drew them. They're in the sketch Commissioner Marsh is holding." She didn't look at Hatch's feet. She looked at Marsh. "They are the prints of a heavy man in town boots. Smooth sole high heel. Not a working farmer's boot. The kind of boot a man wears when he is the kind of man who has others do his work for him." She sat down. The room did not make a sound. And then, because rooms in small counties are full of people who have known each other for years and know each other's horses and know what kind of boot each other wears, every eye in the room moved. Slowly. Together. Downward. To the boots of Roland Hatch. Good dark leather. High heel. Smooth sole. Polished, yes. But in the welt. In the seam. In the crease above the heel, where a man's weight presses deepest in soft, wet ground. Gray. A fine, pale gray that was not polish and not leather and not anything that had come from inside a house. Dried mud. Nebraska mud from the bank of a spring on the western edge of Granger, pressed deep by a heavy man moving fast in the dark. Hatch did not move. He had a face built for composure. He had spent 30 years building that face, and it held. His hands in his lap were still. His back was straight, but the boots were on his feet, and the room was looking at them. And you cannot argue with what a room has already seen. Marsh set down his pen. He looked at the sketch in his hand. He looked at the boots. He looked at the full room of people who had known him for 11 years
and were watching him now with the particular attention of neighbors who are about to find out what kind of person you actually are when the question is real. He was a gray man. He had been a gray man for a long time. Gray meant safe. Gray meant $400 borrowed in a bad year. Didn't have to mean anything except a loan between men who understood each other. Except he had a wife buried in the churchyard at the east end of Granger. 2 children grown and moved to Kansas City who wrote letters at Christmas. He had lived in this county for 30 years and watched it through droughts and blizzards and grasshoppers and a cattle fever in 1869 that had taken half the herds in the area. He had watched families come and go. He had watched the land take some of them and give others back. He had never in 30 years watched a man build something that worked out of a seep spring and split cottonwood logs and old barrels while everyone around him either laughed or tried to stop him. He had never watched a woman stand up in a county hearing and thread an argument so cleanly that the lawyer across the table had nothing left to catch. He set the sketch down flat on the table. He looked at Hatch. "I'm dismissing the claim," he said. Colworth straightened. "Commissioner, the claim is dismissed." Marsh's voice was not loud. It was the voice of a tired man who has decided something and does not intend to undecide it. "The evidence presented does not support prior use. The spring does not feed Mr. Hatch's downstream property in summer months, as confirmed by multiple witnesses with long tenure on adjacent lands." He paused. "Additionally, in light of the damage to the Aldridge property occurring the night before this hearing, and the physical evidence described and documented, I am referring the matter to the county sheriff for investigation." He set the paper down. "Court is adjourned." He stood, picked up his papers, and walked out the way he had come in, quietly, without looking at anyone in particular. A man who had chosen on one Tuesday morning in August to be able to look at himself. That was all. That was everything. The room let out its breath. Not all at once. In stages. The way pressure releases from a system when you open the right valve. A murmur first, then voices, then the particular sound of many people standing up at the same time and beginning to talk. Hatch stood. He looked at Colworth, and something passed between them that had no words. Colworth closed his satchel. They walked toward the door. The room opened a path for them without anyone appearing to make a decision about it. People simply found themselves a step to the left or right as the 2 men passed. Hatch reached the door. He stopped. He turned once, looked back into the room, not at Emmett, not at Wren, at the room itself, at the 20-odd people who had turned up on a dry Tuesday morning and had watched and had not looked away and had not pretended not to see what they had seen. He looked at them for a moment. Then he left. The door closed behind him. Wren sat on the bench and did not move for a while. She was aware of Emmett beside her, of his hand which had found hers at some point during Marsh's ruling and had not let go. Of Cora, 3 rows back, talking to the Bachmans in a low, even voice, with the matter-of-fact manner of a woman wrapping up a piece of work that has been done correctly. Of Briggs near the door, already leaving hat back on, moving quickly, but taking something with him that he hadn't carried in. She was aware of the different quality of being looked at now versus every other time in her life. Not the wedding, not the mercantile, not the fence on the section road. This was a room full of people who had just watched someone they had written off do something they could not have predicted, and who were revising their understanding, not just of that person, but of themselves, of what they had assumed, of what they had been so certain about. Emmett squeezed her hand once. She squeezed back. They didn't need words for it. They had built too many things together to need words for the moment when the thing holds. The sheriff opened an investigation. Roland Hatch did not contest it. After a month of quiet negotiation conducted at a distance, he paid the Aldridges the full cost of every flume and barrel and yard of canvas that had been destroyed. The payment came in the form of a bank draft. No letter, no explanation, just the draft. Wren held it for a moment when it arrived. Then she put it on the table beside Emmett's book of water figures, and they looked at it together. And then she went and put it in the tin box under the floorboard, where they kept the things that mattered. Hatch sold the large spread north of Granger in October. The sale was handled through a broker in Lincoln, and the price was lower than the land was worth. Lower than it would have been before August. Lower than it would have been before a Tuesday morning, when a water commissioner in a gray suit had looked at a pair of muddy boots and decided what kind of man he was. He went east. Nobody knew exactly where. Nobody asked with any urgency. The land was divided among 12 families. Families who had been behind on notes that were now owed to no one. Families who had watched their corn curl and had then watched something happen at the western edge of the county that had made them think differently about what a dry summer could mean. Emmett rebuilt the system in September. He could have rebuilt it faster. The Bachmans came and helped. 3 families who had watched the hearing brought timber. A man named Waverly, who had farmed 2 miles east and had not come to the hearing and had not spoken to either Aldridge all summer, appeared one morning with a load of clear-grained cottonwood in his wagon. He set it down by the spring mouth and left without explanation. Wren looked at the timber for a long moment. Then she went inside and made an extra pie and left it on Waverly's doorstep that evening. No note, no explanation, just the pie. The new system was better than the old one. Not because Emmett had changed his design, the design had been right from the beginning, but because building it a second time with better wood and the knowledge of exactly how each joint needed to be fitted and where each fall needed to be set, produced something quieter and steadier that lost even less water than the first version had. Emmett added 2 new lines, one to the lower section of the kitchen garden where the onions had always been slightly dry, one carrying water across the back fence to Cora's tomatoes, which she had been nursing through a hand bucket all summer, and which responded to the delivered water with an enthusiasm that made Cora stand at her fence and say simply to no one in particular, "Well?" The fruit trees went into fall looking like trees that had already decided they were going to be fine. By the end of October, 3 families had come to the Aldrich place on separate occasions and asked Emmett to walk their land with them. He went each time, brought his level and his book, and walked each parcel the way he had walked his own, read the slope and the drainage, told each family what he found, where the water went, where the fall was, what they had that they hadn't known how to use. He did not charge for this. Wren did not argue with him about it. She understood what it was. Not charity, not even generosity exactly. It was the natural movement of a thing that had been proven. Water flows toward what is lower and ready to receive it. Knowledge does the same. You cannot build a system that works and then keep it only for yourself. The system itself objects. It wants to branch. Winter came hard and early that year. By December, the ground was frozen, and the spring ran in a thin, cold thread under a shell of ice that Emmett broke each morning with a small hammer, so the line kept flowing to the barrels, which he had lagged with straw against the frost. It was extra work in the dark, cold mornings, and neither of them pretended otherwise. But the water ran, even in December. Even when the whole county was ice and brown and waiting. The spring gave its small, steady measure, and the system carried it, and the root cellars and the store of canned goods from the summer's harvest waited in their rows for spring. On a Sunday in late January, Wren sat at the table and wrote a letter to her sister in Ohio. Her sister had written first in September after Wren had sent a brief account of the summer. The letter from Ohio had contained the expected questions and the expected admiration, and then, near the end, the question Wren had been waiting for. Was she happy? Was the life she had chosen, the man she had chosen, actually the life she had thought it would be? Wren sat with the blank paper for a long while. She thought about being asked that question in April 1874 on the wagon with Emmett headed toward a quarter section neither of them had seen. She would have said yes. She had believed yes, but that yes was built on faith alone, on instinct and the way a man held a loop to a clockwork and found the slipped gear. Now the yes was different. It was built from a summer's worth of proof. She wrote, "I am happy. Not in the way I expected to be happy, which I think means I am happy in a better way. He is not what they thought he was, and I turned out to be more than I thought I was. I think that is what a good marriage does if you let it." She sealed the letter and put it with the ones going to town. Then she went to the window and looked out at the January land, white and still and resting. Under the ice in the darkness of the frozen ground, the root systems of 6 fruit trees were waiting, patient, already planning for spring. The spring was still running. It always had been.